Now next topic, white matter of the cerebellum sphere is the internal capsule. So section through one cerebral hemisphere at the level of insula or posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. At this level, one can see some of the major nuclei of basal ganglion. Lentiform nucleus, is head of the caudate nucleus. And thalamus. Claustrum, and this is gray matter of the insula. Now the internal capsule comprise of different parts. Anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, Retrolentiform part, and Sublentiform part of the internal capsule. Now internal capsule is an inverted V-shaped band of white matter. Above it is the corona radiata, and below is the crus cerebri of the midbrain. Now suppose this is internal capsule. So the fibers arising from cerebral cortex they converge in a fan-shaped manner from the cerebral cortex to the corpus diatom, known as the corona radiata. These fibers then pass through internal capsule. And from the internal capsule, these fibers pass through the ventral part of the midbrain. Crus cerebri. Therefore, above the level of internal capsule is the corona radiata in each cerebellum hemisphere, and below the internal capsule level there is crus cerebri of the midbrain, anterior part of the midbrain. So above corona radiata and below crus cerebri, and it is inverted mass of white matter known as the internal white matter known as the internal capsule. It comprises of projection fibers. And these projection fibers are both motor and sensory. The motor tracts descend and the sensory tracts ascend. There are different motor tracts which descend through the internal capsule, and the sensory tracts, they are thalamocortical fibers. Which ascend through the internal capsule. Now if we cut a section, horizontal section through cerebral hemisphere at the level of insula, these projection fibers in the form of corona radiata passes through some of the major nuclei of the basal ganglion. So the internal capsule comprises of various parts. This is anterior limb, this is posterior limb, and this is genu. Anterior limb of the internal capsule, posterior limb of the internal capsule, and here in the middle is the genu. So the different parts of internal capsule are anterior limb, genu, posterior limb. The other two parts are retrolentiform part and sublentiform part. Now in a section cut through the cerebral hemisphere at the level of insula, only anterior limb, genu and posterior limbs are visualized. The other two parts, that is retrolentiform part and sublentiform part, they are not visualized in this section. Only three parts are visualized in this section. The anterior limb, you can see it traverses between the lentiform nucleus and head of the caudate nucleus. Lentiform nucleus laterally and caudate nucleus head. Medially. And then posterior limb, again laterally is the lentiform nucleus and medially is the thalamus. The other two parts, as their name indicate, retrolentiform part, it lies behind the lentiform nucleus, posterior to the lentiform. Retrolentiform part or post-lentiform. Part, and the other part is below the lentiform nucleus and known as the sublentiform part. Now if we draw a three-dimensional view of the internal capsule traversing between some major nuclei of the cerebrum, now this is suppose lentiform nucleus. Then internal capsule, anterior limb, then genu and posterior limb. So a three-dimensional view of the lentiform nucleus and internal capsule, and here is the claustrum. Lentiform nucleus. This is caudate nucleus, head of the caudate nucleus. This is thalamus, claustrum, in between these is the different parts of lentiform nucleus. Now you can in between different parts of the internal capsule. So you can see here between lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus, this is anterior limb. Of internal capsule, which intervene between the lentiform nucleus laterally and the head of the caudate nucleus medially. And here is the genu of the internal capsule. Then behind the lentiform nucleus, this is posterior limb. Of the lentiform nucleus. And this portion, one can see, is posterior to the lentiform nucleus. This part of the internal capsule is behind the lentiform nucleus, known as the retrolentiform. Part of the internal capsule, also known as post-lentiform. Part of the internal capsule located posterior to the lentiform nucleus. Then one can see here this part which is below the lentiform nucleus. This is sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So a three-dimensional view of the internal capsule along with some major nuclei of the basal ganglion will help you to understand the anterior limb of the internal capsule. This is posterior limb of the internal capsule between lentiform nucleus and thalamus. Between the anterior and posterior limb, this is genu. And this part you can see is just behind the lentiform nucleus. So it is known as the retrolentiform or post-lentiform part of the internal capsule. And this portion, which is located below the lentiform nucleus, is known as the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So these were different parts of the lentiform nucleus. Now, the projection fibers ascend and descend in the form of ascending tracts and descending tracts. Pass through the internal capsule. So as I told you, the nerve fibers are arcuate fibers, association fibers, and projection fibers. So the internal capsule is only comprising of projection fibers. The ascending are sensory tracts and the descending are motor tracts. They pass through the different portions of the internal capsule. Now, what are the ascending tracts? Ascending fibers. These are thalamocortical fibers. And in the last lecture I explained that all the sensory fibers, they relay in the thalamus except the sense of smell. And from the thalamus, the nerve fibers arise which pass through the internal capsule and relay in the sensory cortex known as the thalamocortical fibers. Connect the thalamus with the sensory cortex. So the ascending tracts are fibers passing through the internal capsule are ascending fibers. Ascending tracts. Now what are the descending tracts passing through the internal capsule? These are cortico-ruberal tracts. From cortex pass through the corona radiata, internal capsule, enter the midbrain where they end in the red nucleus, the cortico-ruberal tracts. Second, cortico-pontine tracts. The fibers arises from the cerebral cortex, corona radiata, internal capsule, pass through the midbrain, enter the pons where they terminate in the pontine nuclei. So cortico-pontine tracts. Cortico-nuclear tracts. Again arising from the motor cortex, passes through the corona radiata, internal capsule, then descend through the midbrain, pons, enter the medulla oblongata where they relay into the various motor nuclei of the medulla oblongata called cortico-nuclear tracts. Then again another tract, cortico-spinal tracts, also known as pyramidal tracts. Cortico-spinal or pyramidal tracts arises from the cerebral cortex, descend through the corona radiata, internal capsule, crus cerebri, midbrain, pons, ventral part, medulla oblongata, enter the spinal cord where they terminate in the anterior horn of the spinal cord at different levels. These are cortico-spinal tracts because they descend to the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. This is why they are also known as the pyramidal tracts. So these are the detail about different tracts. Motor tracts are descending tracts, and the ascending tract is thalamocortical fibers. These ascend and descend through the internal capsule. Now, what are the different parts of fibers which pass through different parts of the internal capsule? Anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform part and sublentiform part. Now, first of all, the anterior limb. What are the different tracts which descend through anterior limb? Motor fibers and sensory fibers. Motor tracts and sensory tracts passing through the anterior limb of internal capsule. The motor tracts passing through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. These are cortico-pontine and corticostriate fibers. Cortico-pontine and corticostriate. Cortico-pontine and corticostriate fibers. pass through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Then sensory tracts are thalamocortical. Fibers pass through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Next, which tracts pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule? Again, motor and sensory tracts. Motor and sensory tracts passing through the posterior limb are cortico-rubral tracts. Cortico-rubral, from cortex to the red nucleus of the midbrain. Cortico-rubral, cortico-pontine, corticospinal. Cortico-rubral, cortico-pontine, and corticospinal tracts. Passes through the posterior limb, the motor tracts, and the sensory tracts are thalamocortical fibers again. Thalamocortical fibers. These are the fibers passing through the posterior limb. Next, the genu. What are the motor tracts passing through the genu, and what are the sensory tracts passing through the genu of the internal capsule? The corticonuclear and corticospinal tracts. Corticonuclear and corticospinal tracts. They pass through the genu, and the sensory tracts are again thalamocortical. Fibers, they pass from thalamus on the way to the sensory cortex. They pass through the internal capsule. Next is retrolentiform part. What are the motor and sensory tracts? Passing through the retrolentiform part. Motor tracts are cortico-pontine. Cortico-pontine tracts, and sensory are thalamocortical. Fibers. So you can see this sensory fibers through all parts of the internal capsule are thalamocortical fibers. Retrolentiform part, apart from the thalamocortical fibers, optic radiation fibers also passes. Optic radiation fibers, also known as geniculo calcarine fibers. You know the visual pathway, right and left eyeballs, then through optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tracts, divided into medial root and lateral root. And here is the midbrain section. Medial root enter the midbrain, and the lateral root relay in the lateral geniculate body. From the lateral geniculate body, optic radiation arises. Which terminate in the visual cortex, occipital lobe, visual cortex, area number 17, 18, 19, calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus. So you can see the fibers arise from the lateral geniculate body. From it, these fibers live in the form of optic radiation and terminate in the visual cortex located in the calcarine sulcus. These fibers between lateral geniculate body and the visual cortex known as the optic radiation, also known as geniculo-calcarine fibers. From lateral geniculate body to calcarine sulcus, where there is visual center, area 17, 18, 19. So optic radiation, also known as the geniculo-calcarine fibers. So the retrolentiform part, the sensory fibers passing through the retrolentiform part are not only the thalamocortical fibers, but also the optic radiation or geniculo-calcarine fibers. Then sublentiform part of the internal capsule. Sublentiform part, again motor tracts and sensory tracts passing through the sublentiform part. Motor tracts are cortico-pontine fibers. Cortico-pontine fibers, and the sensory tracts, they are the thalamocortical fibers and auditory radiation. Part of the hearing, acoustic, auditory radiation. Auditory radiation is also known as geniculo-temporal. Geniculo-temporal fibers. Just like geniculo-calcarine fibers, a visual pathway, optic radiation arises from lateral geniculate body to the calcarine sulcus, where there is the visual center. Here again, in the auditory pathway, hearing pathway, geniculo-temporal fibers arise. That is, they arise from medial geniculate body. To area number 41, 42, temporal lobe, auditory center. So these are details about different ascending and descending tracts passing through anterior limb, posterior limb, genu, retrolentiform and sublentiform parts of the internal capsule. Now, what are the different representation of different parts of the body through the internal capsule? Anterior limb, genu and posterior limb. Anterior limb of internal capsule, genu of the internal capsule, and this is posterior limb of the internal capsule. Now, which fibers they pass through different parts of the internal capsule from which parts of the human body? They live through the internal capsule. Here, anterior limb. Here is corticostriate. Fibers pass through the anterior limb. The fibers arising from the cerebral cortex to the corpus striatum. And then this part of the anterior limb. Through it, which fibers pass? That is Cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers. Cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers pass through it. Now, Cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers. Now, front view of the right and left cerebral hemisphere section. Then midbrain. In pons. And medulla oblongata. And behind it is the cerebellum, right cerebellar hemisphere and left cerebellar hemisphere. And the cerebral cortex
right and left cerebral hemisphere. And this is the middle line of the pons, right half, left half, just for descriptive purposes. So what happens that the cortico-pontine fibers arise from the cerebral cortex, pass through the corona radiata, passes through the internal capsule, descend through the crus cerebri of the midbrain, and enter into the ventral part of the pons. In the pons there are pontine nuclei, several nuclei. I've drawn one nucleus, large U. So these fibers arise from the cortex to the pontine, known as the cortico-pontine fibers. And these fibers terminate on the pontine nuclei on the right side. For example, this is right cerebral hemisphere, this is left cerebral hemisphere. Then from here, the fibers continue, cross the midline, and terminate in the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. This is suppose left cerebellar hemisphere. Similarly, the cortico-pontine fibers from the left cerebral hemisphere run through the corona radiata, internal capsule, then midbrain, enter the left half of the ventral portion of the pons, relay in the pontine nuclei of the left side, cross the midline, and enter the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. So from here up to here, these fibers are known as the cortico-pontine fibers. And from pontine nucleus to the opposite cerebellar hemisphere, these fibers are known as the ponto-cerebellar fibers. Ponto-cerebellar fibers. So you can see the link between cerebral cortex and opposite cerebral hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere, cortico-pontine and ponto-cerebellar fibers. Collectively, this pathway is known as the cortico-ponto-cerebellar pathway. Collectively called cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers. So this entire part of the internal capsule, through it traverses the cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers. These fibers which connect the cerebral cortex with the pons of the same side, same half, and from the pons they cross the midline and enter into the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. This part of the pathway is called cortico-pontine fibers, and from pontine nuclei to the opposite hemisphere called ponto-cerebellar fibers. Collectively, this whole pathway is known as the cortico-ponto-cerebellar fibers. Now, which tracts from which region of the body passes through the genu, the head? The head region. Now fibers from which part of the human body passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule? So these are upper limb, then trunk, then lower limb, and then perineum. perineal region. Through the genu, the nerve fibers ascending, descending tracts from the head region of the body, they pass through the genu, and through the posterior limb, from before backwards, is the fibers from upper limb, followed by fibers from trunk of the body, then followed by fibers from lower limb, and then lastly it is the perineal region. This is how we locate these fibers in case of internal capsule, especially genu and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. These fibers ascend and descend. Now, one important applied aspect of fibers are the Broca's area. The fibers from motor speech area, that is Broca's area, are involved in the lesion of left internal capsule. The fibers regarding Broca's area, which is motor speech area, they are involved in the lesion of left internal capsule, not right. Why? Because in more than 90% of the people, the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant. Or in other words, the left cerebral hemisphere is a major hemisphere. And in 10% of cases, it is the left cerebral hemisphere, it is the right cerebral hemisphere which is dominant. So, in the lesion of right internal capsule lesion, the speech is not affected. But if there is lesion of the left internal capsule, there will be loss of speech, because the left cerebral hemisphere, left internal capsule, it is dominant in more than 90% of the people. So again I will repeat that it is the lesion of the left internal capsule which cause damage to the fibers regarding motor speech area or Broca's area, not right internal capsule. So when the left internal capsule is damaged, lesion of the left internal capsule, it will result in loss of speech. Associated with right hemiplegia. When the left internal capsule is damaged, there will be loss of speech, and it will be associated not with paralysis of left side but right side. Why? Because the left cerebral hemisphere controls the movements of right half of the body and vice versa. And because in more than 90% the left cerebral hemisphere is a major hemisphere, therefore lesion of the left internal capsule will result in loss of speech, and this loss of speech will be associated with paralysis of the right half of the body. right hemiplegia, not left, because internal capsule, left internal capsule belong to the left cerebral hemisphere, which is dominant hemisphere. So this was an important applied aspect of the lesion of the left internal capsule. Now again I will draw a sectional view. You know, this is a lentiform nucleus. Then this is claustrum, and then gray matter of the insula. Claustrum, lentiform nucleus, then gray matter of the insula, insular cortex, head of the caudate nucleus, thalamus. So here between the lentiform nucleus and claustrum, again there is a layer of white matter. This is known as the extreme capsule, external capsule. A layer of white matter. This is internal capsule, as we discussed. Then again between claustrum and gray matter of the insula, again there is a layer of white matter. This is known as extreme capsule. So we finished with the internal capsule, then there is external capsule, and then there is extreme capsule. All are bands of white matter. Now the external capsule, it comprises of two types of fibers, that is projection fibers and external capsule. It comprises of two types of fibers. Projection and commissural fibers. The external capsule comprises of projection fibers and commissural fibers. The projection fibers link between the insula and subthalamus. Link between insula and subthalamus. The projection fibers which pass through the external capsule, which is located between lentiform nucleus and claustrum. This comprises of nerve fibers, and these are projection fibers which connect the insula and subthalamus. And there are commissural fibers which link between the insula of both cerebral hemispheres. Link insula of both right and left cerebral hemispheres, because these are commissural fibers which connect both sides. So right insula is connected with the left insula, in other words. So these are the nerve fibers which pass through the external capsule. Next is the extreme capsule. This capsule, which is located between the claustrum and gray matter of the insula. Extreme capsule. The extreme capsule, which is located between the claustrum and gray matter of the insula. Extreme. It also is the white matter and comprised of nerve fibers. Which fibers? Association fibers. Comprise of association fibers. The extreme capsule only comprise of association fibers. These are the association fibers of insula. So this was briefly about some parts of the white matter of each cerebral hemisphere in the form of so-called capsules. We talk about the internal capsule in detail, its different parts and various ascending and descending tracts. So you have seen that the internal capsule is only comprising of projection fibers. Only projection fibers, they ascend and descend through the internal capsule. Now if we compare it with the external capsule located between the lentiform nucleus and the claustrum, it comprises of two types of fibers, projection fibers and commissural fibers. Projection fibers connect the insula with and subthalamus. This link between these, and commissural fibers link the insula of both sides, right insula with the left insula. Then the extreme capsule between claustrum and insular gray matter, it again comprises of only one type of fiber, that is association fibers which connect the insula. So with this we finished with the internal capsule, external capsule and extreme capsules. Thank you very much.